By the 1850s, the township of Goodna and the surrounding area was growing in population. Mining, farming, and the arrival of the railway all brought new citizens. When people died, the only cemetery was in Ipswich, many miles away. By the mid-19th century, Goodna was a thriving township on the way to Ipswich. With the opening up of the Darling Downs and the arrival of the railway, its population swelled. Local people wanted their own place to be laid to rest. In 1859, the same year Queensland separated from New South Wales, land was granted for a cemetery on the town's outskirts. A trust was created, made up of local residents, to organise burials and fence and maintain the grounds. In the olden days, horse-drawn hearses brought the deceased in their coffins from Riverview, Redbank and Redbank Plains, Wacol and Walston, and even patients and staff of the Goodna Mental Asylum. Each death cast a gloom over the township. When children died, the local school flew the flag at half-mast. 160 years later, the cemetery is the eternal resting place of around 2,000 people and is beautifully maintained. The Goodna Cemetery Trust is the oldest in Queensland. It operates with no funding from government and relies on fees from burials and a lease from the crematorium. There are many mysteries, legends and stories connected to Goodna Cemetery. The cemetery is said to be one of the most haunted graveyards in Queensland. Beginning in the 1960s and 70s, teenagers from Brisbane, and also from Ipswich, would load into a car or cars and head to Goodna Cemetery. It was the thing to do, to try and see a ghost. Goodna was then on the outskirts of Brisbane, a long way out of town. Western suburbs teens knew the stories of Goodna Cemetery being haunted. Dressed in their bell-bottom jeans and t-shirts, they would come by the carload to creep themselves. They would cross the Jindalee Bridge, go by the Wacol Army Barracks and prison, past the old Goodna Mental Asylum, through the township of Goodna, and end up at the cemetery. They would park on the edge of it. Back then there were no street lights and it was surrounded by dense bushland, remote and very, very spooky. Most of these early urban explorers did nothing wrong. They didn't damage graves. It was simply an adventure to them. And they were in search of ghosts and hoped to see one. Awfully, not all of those that came into the cemetery were interested in history and heritage. The remoteness of the cemetery made it the perfect location for those interested in the dark arts and black magic. The surrounding forest provided protection from prying eyes. Among the gravestones, some say, Satanists conjured up the devil. Black witches were said to meet and speak to spirits through rituals and bend them to their will. After they were finished, the poor souls dragged from beyond were said to have been abandoned to wander the cemetery grounds, or so some say. It's more likely it was just amateur pretenders than serious practitioners of the dark arts. The most well-known haunted grave in Goodna Cemetery is the Headless Angel. Stories of it have haunted visitors for more than 50 years. It was once complete. The statue originally had a head and feathered wings attached to its back. In the 1960s, if you were brave enough to stand alone in front of the statue at night, some versions say it had to be midnight, the angel's head was said to slowly turn right around, a full 180 degrees. By the 1970s, the angel's wings and forearms were broken off. Then it was decapitated. Apparently, a local idiot from Wacol was responsible, and he proudly took the head home. He eventually just threw it away. Then a more gruesome story began to be told, that blood would gush out the broken stump. Another version was that the missing head would appear on its neck and stare. If this happened, you would soon end up dead and buried in the cemetery, In 2009, a group of teenage vandals attacked the cemetery, causing tens of thousands of dollars damage. The Headless Angel was knocked onto its side. But who was this memorial originally intended for? It was once Goodna Cemetery's most beautiful memorial. Paid for by a distraught husband, grieving the loss of his wife, the statue would today cost many thousands of dollars to create. It was dedicated to Teresa Costa, who died a century ago on the 23rd of March 1922, aged a mere 45 years. She died in the Goodna Hospital for the Insane, just shy of 5 months after arriving in Australia with her family on an immigrant ship from Genoa. She had been suffering from acute mania, what today we would call bipolar disorder. She exhibited wild mood swings and erratic behaviour, and was even violent. What exactly caused her mania is unknown, but it came on suddenly, to the distress of her family. She had to be hospitalised. They had no choice. But in the asylum, she passed away. Highly detailed and lifelike, the statue was very expensive. A once-off piece of artwork, not a copy. Today it would cost the best part of $50,000. Italian people believe that the more money spent on a grave, the more it shows how much they love the deceased. Where Attilio got the money from is unknown. He must have brought it with him. The figure was carved from the finest quality Carrara marble, depicting the deceased lady as a heavenly angel. On each side of the square base were marble panels with inscriptions. Though now largely destroyed, one section can still be read. Teresa was a wife and unparalleled mother to her sons. Perhaps the real mystery is exactly where she is buried. Her death certificate records that she was buried in the Goodna Asylum cemetery 2 days after she passed away. Yet her memorial is here in the Goodna Cemetery. But Teresa is not recorded in the cemetery's burial register. It is likely she is in the cemetery beneath her memorial. Many other people were transferred from the hospital, the asylum, and were reburied in the same section as her. These people too are not recorded in the cemetery register. After her death, Attilio took his family north, finding work on sugar plantations as a labourer. One of the mysteries of Goodna Cemetery is the exact location of hundreds of graves that were moved from the old Goodna Hospital for the Insane. In one part of the cemetery grounds, standing in rows, bordered by bushland on one side and suburbia on the other, are hundreds of concrete markers, each displaying a letter and a number made of stone aggregate. The markers today form a memorial to those who died at the nearby asylum. At night, locals say they've seen ghostly figures of people, young and old, walking among the stones as if searching for their own grave marker. One of my favourite ghost stories of Goodna Cemetery comes from Ted. One night as a teenager in the 1960s, he and some friends drove out to Goodna Cemetery. Back then there was a gate that vehicles drove through to get into the grounds. After exploring the graveyard, they returned to their car thoroughly spooked. Then they noticed there was a dent in the boot. Someone or something had damaged it. Now they decided to leave in a very large hurry. They jumped in, but the car wouldn't start. The girls that were with them started to scream in panic. One of the guys got out and started to push. Then they realised the gate had been shut and bolted. He opened the gate, pushed the car through, jumped in. As the driver kept trying to start the car, it just would not start. But as it rolled out onto the road, the engine turned over. When they arrived home, they found tiny handprints all over the paintwork. Goodna Cemetery was said to have the graves of many hundreds of little children. 6 children's graves were the focus of those early ghost hunters exploring the grounds. It was said that you had to find each grave, place a flower on it, before you could leave the cemetery and go home.